Jericho Road Solutions, but she's speaking today on behalf of the Heart of Hastings Community Land Trust. Hello, Jess. Jonathan Gordon-Farleigh, he's a founding director of Stir to Action, which is an organisation building a new economy based on democratic ownership. And it does that through workshop programmes, strategic economic development, and a quarterly magazine. John is also a founding director of Selgar's Mill, a residential education centre in Devon, which is the venue for the Stir to Action Festival as well. And finally, we have Greg Pickup, who is the Chief Executive of Heritage Lincolnshire, one of the largest and most active building preservation trusts in the country. He also sits on the board of the Arkwright Society, who are the custodians of Richard Arkwright's Cromford Mills in Derbyshire. And Greg has also just joined the board of the Architectural Heritage Fund. So welcome to all our panelists. Thank you for joining us today. Just to set the scene briefly before we crack on, the title of today's session is Beyond Retail, Rethinking the High Street. And the place we're kind of starting from, I think, today is that I think it's kind of widely accepted, has been for many years now, that there is too much retail on our high streets. I think we're all agreed on that. Everyone knows the reasons for this. We don't need to get into that today. We do know that there are big structural changes happening on the high street, and it's been an ongoing process for many years, but now with COVID, it feels like everything's been kind of being compressed into a year rather than many years at the moment. But what we want to focus on today is what the future high street needs to look like in terms of the mix of uses and its function. And of course, we're interested particularly in reusing vacant space in historic buildings and the potential for greater community ownership of historic buildings in town centres. So the way it's going to work today is that Johnny is going to kick off with a presentation on connecting some individual initiatives with national frameworks like community wealth building, community economic development, and the community business movement. And from there, Jess and then Greg will talk about their experiences in specific locations in Hastings and Lincolnshire. And we'll follow that with a conversation to explore some of the issues that come up during this session. So with that, I will hand you over to Jonathan.
Cool, thank you for the introduction, Gavin. So yeah, I'm Johnny from Stir to Action, and we're a learning partner on AHF's Transforming Places Through Heritage programme over the next 3 years. And this session's on inclusive heritage, which is about connecting individual initiatives into national frameworks and campaigns. Most of our work's about creating more meaningful and effective interactions between what you might call in-place initiatives and national frameworks and campaigns. That comes out of a kind of place where we generally think that there's been a major failure to connect these kind of two distinctive strands of economic change. In terms of national frameworks, they can often be produced and presented in a way that appears to be at a far removed from the kind of lived experience of practice of those in different places. But at the same time, in terms of local initiatives, they can be at risk of missing out on some of these policy benefits. They might lack the strategic context to access resources and funding from these national frameworks and campaigns, and in doing so kind of fail to frame what they're doing locally, their local efforts, so that the impact they're making is recognised at the kind of regional and national levels. So obviously the UK's heritage assets do not exist in isolation. They're part of local, regional and national economies, and they can play a role in what is known as placemaking, which can be defined as a people-centred approach to planning, design and management of public spaces. Put simply, it's about capitalising on community assets and potential with the aim of promoting people's health, happiness and well-being. In his work on the Heritage Index and placemaking at the RSA, Jonathan Schaferis suggests that socially productive places are neighbourhoods and districts where people are enabled individually and collectively to meet their own needs and achieve their aspirations for issues which matter to them. And in the same piece, really importantly here, he draws out this dependency between heritage assets and what we'll call economic and social outcomes, by arguing that the long-term property value and property use of heritage assets is driven by the long-term economic relevance of that building, and that ultimately the success of a development should be judged by that impact, i.e. those who use it, its ability to contribute to these broader set of social and economic outcomes, however they're defined locally. Next slide, please. A term that we use for this work is community economic development, and I borrow my definition from Rachel Lawrence, who was formerly of the New Economics Foundation, and Rachel suggests that community economic development is not about supporting individuals to function better within their current environment, but to transform the underlying economic system. And within community economic development, I'm going to break that down into two approaches that I'll look at today that I think underpin the work. One is a business model, community business, and the other is a national policy framework for local economic regeneration. I'll just quickly outline the existing community business sector, the role it might play in terms of heritage on the high street in a case study, Stretford Public Hall. And then I'll really quickly explore community wealth building, not only as a kind of policy package, but as an approach that can be applicable and position heritage within, national frameworks and campaigns. Next slide, please. And just to say, this was a 40-minute presentation that became a 30-minute presentation, is now a 20-minute presentation. So excuse brevity in my presentation today. So in terms of a kind of a whirlwind tour community business, there's more than 7,000 community businesses in the UK. In terms of a definition, we can look to Power to Change, who are the kind of, the main funder of community business in the UK, and have been doing a lot of work around taking back the high street. And as we found out towards the end of last week, are doing an event either at the moment or it's just happened, also looking to high streets and community business. But essentially, they suggest that there's four kind of aspects to a community business. So firstly, locally rooted. So they're rooted in a particular geographical place and respond to its needs. So that might be urban deprivation or it might be rural isolation. They trade for the benefit of the local community. So their businesses, their trading entities, and their income comes from things like renting out space in their buildings, trading as cafes, selling produce, generating energy. It's a very broad sector operating in lots of different industries. A really important one, they're accountable to the local community. Often this is achieved through community share offers, where people invest in the initiative and take a stake in it as a co-owner, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And broad community impact, obviously, the important bit here is broad. Often they kind of morph into being the kind of hub of a neighbourhood, where all different types of local groups can gather. So a community business is not a legal structure in itself. There can be a broad range of different legal structures, though the Community Benefit Society is the most common. In terms of heritage initiatives and the way that Power to Change define it, Power to Change will recognise charitable trusts, CICs, and a range of legal structures as community businesses, so long as they meet the criteria and those they can demonstrate that they meet those kind of four approaches. So now I'm going to take a look at Stretford Public Hall in Manchester. Next slide, please. Just to kind of look at how a community business can transform the role a heritage asset plays in community economic development. So just to start with a quick bit of history, it was built in 1878 by John Ryland, known locally as the Cotton King, and was Manchester's first multi-millionaire. Since then, it's been a public hall, council offices, a civic theatre, council offices again, and since 2015, it's been a building that has been saved and now owned by the Friends of Stretford Public Hall. It's a community venue, a consultation and census hub, and during the first lockdown, a rapid response centre working in partnership with the local council. Next slide. Just to touch on a few of the benefits of being a community business by looking at Stretford Public Hall. The first one's democratic finance. So I've mentioned community shares, and I'll talk a little bit more about them on another slide. But Stretford Public Hall offered community shares as a way for local investors to feel pride and ownership in the community venue from the very beginning, and the hall could build up its membership base before the doors were actually opened. That then leads to this membership base. So the membership model of a community business is really important. At Stretford Public Hall, they have an 800-strong membership. That covers a kind of broad, quite diverse age profile, supports local connection, as you'll see in the investor profiles, which I'll show in a minute, really supports the high level of volunteer mobilisation within the initiative. And as anybody that works in a community business will tell you, it really, really supports the kind of user customer loyalty that you'll see in the sector. There's a really useful report from the Plunkett Foundation, The State of Rural Community Business, which outlines the sense of connection between community businesses and the emergency response to COVID that we've seen since mid-March. Community anchors. So community anchors is a kind of phrase that has been used in lots of different ways. It's used in community wealth building too. And in terms of being a community anchor, as a community business, it gave the whole legitimacy as a community anchor, especially to facilitate consultations around local economic development. Any local development, as we all know, can be extremely divisive, but Stretford Public Hall's large, broad membership kind of put it in a position to be a neutral partner and to use its positive influence in the local community, again, mobilising higher engagement in local consultations, which in some communities people can often be indifferent to. And then there's the rapid response. With the rapid response, Stretford Public Hall, again, because it was a community anchor and because of its membership model, had really good relationships with the local councils, and it became a rapid response centre. It was an emergency call centre and a food distribution hub. And interestingly, recently talking to some of the board at Stretford Public Hall, they became the local food distribution centre because the local food bank closed because of the high-risk ages of its volunteers, because of their vulnerability. And it's not to say that all community businesses in all locations are diverse in terms of age profile, but it's certainly part of their role in constituting themselves as broadly as possible from that local community. Next slide, please. So community shares. So I've mentioned these as a kind of form of democratic finance. First thing to say is that they're unique to the society models. So the community benefit society model and the cooperative society, they are a form of withdrawable share capital that basically offers societies the opportunity to raise capital for purchase and renovation. They're often used as part of a funding mix with grants and loans. And like I said earlier, they give investors the opportunity to be a co-owner of a local initiative, and that grants them voting rights, the ability to earn interest on their investment, and if you're a taxpayer, then you can also receive tax relief. To give a sense of the community shares market, former Co-op UK CEO Ed Mayo wrote to the Times last year to say that 100,000 people have now invested in community shares over the last few years. I'm also sure that Gavin will talk a bit more about community shares in the discussion session, but to briefly mention, AHF have got a community booster fund. I think back in February, March, they injected £600,000 to pay for grants of up to £10,000 to community businesses to help them launch their share offers. And then they were also putting in equity investments of up to £50,000 to match amounts raised in local community share offers. Next slide, please. I just wanted to quickly look at the investor location, just to kind of back up the idea of kind of local connection and loyalty and in local areas. I don't know Manchester postcode, so I had to Google this, but M32 is the Stretford postcode, and you can see that 66% of the total was raised. And of course, most of it's still raised within Manchester there. And that really kind of demonstrates the local connection and one of the big benefits of the community buy-in that you get as being a community business. And essentially, that's the people that invest in your place will use it, they'll hire it, they'll volunteer for it, and they'll support the programming and activities for years to come. And of course, potentially be on your board. Imagine being in a position where you've got 800 members that might potentially want to be on your board when you have re-elections. Next slide is on investor profiles. And this is just to kind of quickly look at the kind of the scale of investment. 83% of the investors invested just £90 to £190. Heritage initiatives can obviously kind of over-rely on high net worth individuals and sometimes fail to connect with lower middle earners. Community shares is still a way to attract larger investments, so people can still invest up to £100,000, but it just gives you that opportunity to get people to invest at lower figures. Some community share issues start at £50, some start at £250, £500, depending on the decision from the board, the appetite from the local community. So that's that case study of Stretford Public Hall. The next slide's looking at community wealth building. So many of you may have heard of the Preston model. It's essentially a policy framework adapted from work in Cleveland, Ohio in North America. Part of the framework is around what's called progressive procurement. That's anchor institutions such as universities, hospitals, large businesses redirecting their public spend to local businesses. And the other part of it is to support local economic development through what they call plural models of ownership. Plural meaning just lots of different kind of legal structures such as cooperatives and community businesses. It's a short description on the slide here that kind of outlines the approach, which is a new people-centered approach to local economic development, which redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefits into the hands of local people. I thought I'd take a look at the kind of 5 principles as community wealth building as another kind of easy way to introduce it. Next slide, please. So this work's being translated into these 5 principles, which are making financial power work for local places, plural ownership of the economy, progressive procurement of goods and services, fair employment and just labour markets, and socially productive use of land and property. These principles have been initially set up for institutional bodies, often in the public sector, through the work of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in Manchester, but they can be adapted and are used by lots of different communities in lots of different ways, and there's more and more kind of community level grassroots interpretations of these principles. And so on the next slide, I've skipped the first principle and jumped to the second one around plural ownership models. I thought I might just try and quickly translate these to see how they might be adaptable to kind of in-place heritage initiatives on high streets. So in terms of the first one, how can heritage initiatives encourage and incubate legal structures that offer more member involvement, economic participation, and more local connection and engagement? And specifically for us, that means more cooperatives and community businesses. In terms of progressive procurement of goods and services, how can you use your spending contracting power in local markets? That's from building materials and services to food suppliers to consultants, and using that financial power to change the economic and social outcomes. How can your buildings be involved in creating or enabling fair employment and integration into the labour market, especially for those furthest from employment? This could be through partnership with local training bodies and other civic partners that support education and employment locally. And then the last one around socially productive land and property. How can your heritage asset enable more local people, both individually and collectively, to meet their own needs and achieve their aspirations? And I just wanted to finish with the final slide, looking at youth unemployment. So I've just looked at 2 kind of relatively large national frameworks there. I just thought to close the presentation, it's clear that we can't talk about high streets and economic regeneration without talking about how the pandemic and the economic crisis is impacting youth unemployment. So many parts of the high streets that are retracting and disappearing offer entry-level employment opportunities to young people, and reports from a range of different youth charities are suggesting that 18 to 24-year-olds are the most likely to lose work as a result of the pandemic. Latest analysis suggests that 1 million young people could face a job crisis in just a matter of weeks when the furlough scheme ends this weekend, and they're faced with a scarcity of new positions, especially as a fresh group of school and college leavers enter the market. And of course, government schemes will almost certainly not be sufficient. And of course, they're only temporary measures to help alleviate and not eliminate the problem in the way that community economic development through community wealth building and community business can. So just 2 kind of final questions, kind of provocations from my presentation are, how could your heritage initiative, your asset, be more socially productive in terms of starting or developing an existing offer to support employment for local young people? And how could your initiative partner with local young adult organisations to offer more targeted support to integrate unemployed young adults into local businesses or to start their own businesses? So yeah, thank you. That's my presentation. Back to Gavin.
Thank you, Johnny. Some really interesting subjects there, and good setting up the context for the debate we're going to have it a little bit later, the national framework, and Stretford Public Hall as well as a project that we know really well. And community shares is something that obviously we are very supportive of at the AHF. Just to clarify that the Community Shares Booster programme is an existing programme run by Co-ops UK that we've invested in through the Transforming Places Through Heritage programme. So we've managed to boost some of the community share issues in a number of locations through that. So yeah, we think it's a really interesting and potentially beneficial scheme for particular projects. So this should help now lead into what Jess has to say, looking at all these kind of issues on a local level in Hastings. Jericho Road Solutions has been playing a leading role in the development of the Hastings Commons, which I will let Jess explain to you all now. So please go ahead, Jess. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. That's great. Well, so my interest has been in self-renovating neighbourhoods. The idea that place shaping is something that is genuinely bottom-up, that is not just through being involved in decisions, but actually through active intervention, through ownership, through directly making the place. Bev. I'm going to be saying Bev at the end of each slide, and she knows that's brilliant, thank you. And that's because my background has always been about an approach to heritage that values everyday life of people and the unusual legacy of buildings that they leave behind. And so what we've been trying to think about in Hastings is how you darn the fabric of the place, how you put it back together by revitalising the legacy of those old buildings, but in ways that are intimately connected with people's day-to-day lives. So Bev, in real life, these things don't happen in the way you expect them to. But you have to, there's two things that I've kind of learned from the process over the last 5 or 6 years. One is take opportunities and the other is take risks. And so in terms of take opportunities, by chance, we were just in the right place at the right time to be offered a 1969 office block, a town centre office block, a pre-market sale of an almost empty building, and we went for it. And it's that process of taking risks. We went for it even without having the full plans, without having the money in place. It was about getting on with it, and we take an approach that we call phased organic development, which is also known as a bit at a time. So you just get started, and that's one of my greatest lessons really, is just start. Rock House, that building, is now fully restored with 6 affordable flats and 42 creative and community businesses in it. Bev. But there is still plenty of dereliction. This is one of my favourite pictures. This is the Observer building, a massive 4,000 square metre print factory right next door to our office block in the town centre. It's been abandoned since 1985. So 35 years of dereliction, 13 different owners before us, and all but one of them made money out of this building. Not a single one of them did any repairs to it. This is the kind of thing we're struggling with, and I know people all over the country will have their derelict buildings in their spaces that feel too difficult. However, we have taken this building on. Bev? Here it is in the corner there, as it was just back in 2014. And there in the middle is what it will be. We have planning permission and we have the first chunk of money to translate this old print factory into a vibrant multi-use building with residential, with retail, with workspace, with leisure. And these buildings, just these two, Rock House and the Observer, they're all part of what we call the Hastings Commons, Bev. You can see the buildings there, they're all quite close together. This is about fine grain. And I really believe, I believe in fine grain neighbourhoods anyway, that level just above the single building, the level with a 150 metre radius, or maybe even smaller than that. But when it comes to high streets, I think that's even more important. They're full of interesting and different resources, built fabric resources of all kinds. So all of those buildings that are highlighted there are now in custodian ownership, some of them already in community land trust ownership, and others being developed so that they can be handed over to the community land trust forever. what we do is create capped rents. Bev, next slide, thank you. These are the kinds of uses that are going on in those different buildings. So they're different types of residential, commercial, amenity uses, artist studios, etc. What they have in common is that they all have capped rents, because what we need to be really careful of as we regenerate our high streets with vast amounts of public money and community energy is that we don't just put that money into the same old pockets, which is the pockets of speculative investors, and that we don't lose the affordability of our town centres, which is very close to our hearts in Hastings, where we face both dereliction and gentrification. I keep saying we, so I'll just, Bev, if you can show the next slide. This is what I mean by we. This is a group of organisations, an ecosystem of different organisations that are playing different roles, but together they share a kind of vision and values about what we're trying to achieve with the future of that neighbourhood. And that's about protecting its diversity, protecting its vibrancy, and encouraging it to be the best version of itself. To do that, you need lots of different organisations to play different roles, but they are all interconnected. And together, Bev, next slide, please. Together, they put in an application to Historic England for the Trinity Triangle Heritage Action Zone, which is led by the Heart of Hastings Community Land Trust. I think it's one of just 2 that are not council-led across the country. It's a multifaceted programme. It's very neighbourhood focused, but it's not all about the built fabric. There are some significant buildings that are being renovated, and there are built fabric grants, but there's also grants for social spaces, and there's a lot of training aspects to it. There's a neighbourhood stories programme, and there's a whole set of investigations into things we know we want to understand better, but we don't yet have the answers to. I'm just going to leave you with one example of something we're working on right now, because I think it's really interesting from the perspective of kind of beyond retail. What else could happen? So Bev, if you can show, this is Eagle House. It's historically known as Eagle House. It was an upholsterers and house furnishing place for many years. You can see it on the right there, and your heart sinks. This is a conservation area between 2 rather lovely churches, but sometime in the 1980s that frontage fell off and had to be replaced, and some local architects managed to get permission to put that frontage on. So Historic England recognised this as detrimental to the conservation area, but we also recognise more locally from the community economic development point of view that Dalton's shop will not last. Now, he personally is retiring. It's a large carpet and furniture shop. It would become empty and over time derelict. So what we're trying to do is to, oh, sorry, Bev, next slide. It has this very useful feature. It has several useful features. It's an important site, links 2 parts of the conservation area, one 18 metres higher than the other. So you can come through this building into the very heart of the town centre and the Heritage Action Zone. And behind it, it has this little tucked away alley, which nobody knows about. It belongs to Dalton's, to the carpet shop. And yet, if we can bring that carpet shop into community ownership and rethink its whole purpose, then we get this alley that links through and creates a new piece of public realm, a totally new piece of public realm that's available to the public to link through to whatever uses we put in there. Bev, so to finish, the kind of uses, what we're doing is our whole emerging plan is based on this wheel of well-being. And this comes from the idea that, which I think Johnny was touching on as well, that we need to prioritise a kind of well-being economics in which the well-being of the people is the wealth of the community, and that we see that and recognise that. So this is still economic development, but it's based on well-being. And so what we're hoping for is a co-living space for people who are leaving a supported accommodation after mental health issues and are somewhere on their recovery journey, needing to get back out into the world, but not wanting to be dumped in some 1-bed flat. So co-living with a very beautiful roof level communal areas, and then the centre of the building will be a wellbeing centre for a whole load of different activities, and then the lower ground, which goes straight out into the town centre, I'm really hoping is going to be a community spa. And yesterday I did a little piece of research into that. I went and had a flotation for an hour last night to check whether we're going to have a flotation tank in Hastings one day. So thinking laterally, I think, thinking laterally but not foolishly, basing it in the principles of well-being, but then really asking people, what do you want? What ideas do people have? And that's where all of these ideas have come from, deep engagement over many years, and then more recently on this particular project. So I'd leave it there with well-being and engagement, sustained engagement over the long term. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you, Jess. Really interesting stuff, and really important to know as well, as you said, it's one of only 2 high street heritage action zones in the country that's community led by that kind of trust. And I guess one of the obvious questions for the next session is, why is that? Why are most led by local authorities and only 2 by grassroots community trusts? But we'll come on to that later. Greg is now going to tell us a little bit more about the Heritage Lincolnshire's work in various parts around Lincolnshire, and this is the Old King's Head, I think, in Curtin. So I'll let you pick up from here, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Now, I don't have a slideshow as such for review, but just a few images here of our current Building Preservation Trust project, which is the Old King's Head in Curtin, which is a large village near Boston in Lincolnshire. And we're a county-based building preservation trust. And in addition to running a number of area-based schemes and working with predominantly local authorities on those, we have our own capital building projects. And this is our current BPT project, which is at the heart of the high street in the village of Curtin. It's the oldest secular building in the village, 16th century coaching inn, formerly on the risk register and almost completely derelict. And we are on site at the moment, bringing it back into use, ready for an opening in early next year as a B&B and community facility. And as a charity, we've set up a wholly owned trading arm so that we'll be operating the B&B ourselves, running a cafe and having a community meeting space, as well as a beautiful courtyard area at the rear that will be a real oasis in the summer between the main building and the stable block. So we'll have 9 rooms in total, and the building's been brought back to life in no small part thanks to a purchase acquisition loan from the Architectural Heritage Fund, a significant Heritage Enterprise grant from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, and also a range of other smaller funders, including crowdfunding, largely from the local community that we undertook before the project began. So the theme of today is about how we rethink our high streets to keep them vibrant and economically successful. This is a key building in a large and growing village in Lincolnshire, in a village that's seeing increasing levels of vacancy. And our plan and our work with the local community is to diversify the range of uses in the village. In particular, one of the things that we're hoping to capitalise on is this is a village that is only a couple of miles from a large RSPB reserve that attracts over 50,000 visitors per year. And we're hoping that through this project we can appeal to a proportion of those visitors through working really closely with other voluntary sector partners to bring those people to the village, to stay in the B&B, to use the cafe, to support local employment, but also to benefit other local businesses in the area as a real anchor attraction for the village. So that's the model for this building, and we're also really excited that this is the first such building that we'll be taking on and managing in-house, as opposed to previous buildings that we have repaired and then handed over to other uses, working with other organisations. And we're hoping that this model of taking the building ourselves, operating it through an arm's length body, and growing that, working with the local community, can be a framework we can use elsewhere in the county. So thanks to some recent COVID recovery fund money, we're over the next few months looking at feasibility work on various other projects around the county where we might expand this hospitality business so that we can bring more visitors to historic settlements in the county. We know that in the wake of COVID, there's a huge boom in domestic tourism, and of course that will be subject to the whims of various lockdowns over coming months. But it does seem like, broadly speaking, there's a trend in increasing domestic tourism that is largely here to stay. And we believe that we can help to capitalise on that and hopefully bring people to some lesser known, beautiful historic places in Lincolnshire. Speaking of which, just to finish, a shameless plug that we will be in the next month releasing online bookings for the next year for the Old King's Head. So any of you who aren't currently following our social media, please do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., so that you can be amongst the first to come and stay in our beautifully repaired 16th century coaching inn when it opens to the public in early 2021. And I will leave it there. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you, Greg. I'll be first on the list. If we can actually leave Sheffield by then, I'll be there. Let's hope we can. Well, thanks everybody. I mean, I think what we want to do now is try and bring all of these different themes and topics together into a general discussion. And obviously what we're talking about now is future high streets, what beyond retail. And one of the first questions I had on my list here was really setting up Jess here, because she's got a particular slant on this. But how do we even think about the future when we're right in the middle of this pandemic? What can we do to kind of not make the mistakes that people have made in the past in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to use that to mention something that we're doing in Hastings that I think others might be interested in, which is that we can't just, we need to think differently if we're going to create something different. And to do that, we actually need to release some creativity and with some new or different techniques so that we can change from firefighting to future making, especially this year. We're in constant firefighting mode. Every one of us individually and in various governance scenarios everywhere, at every level. So it's really hard to be in that firefighting mode and to think creatively about what would the future look like. And one tool that we've been using in Hastings through Hastings Emerging Futures, which is a lottery-funded project, is this idea of the 3 horizons. So if Horizon 1 is the status quo, Horizon 3 is this sort of unknown, better future, and Horizon 2 is the disruptive innovations that happen in between, that either positively generate us towards that 3rd horizon of a better world, in whatever sense, or more negatively get captured as innovations and just serve the old world, the sort of business as usual. And so that idea of the 3 horizons, I think it's just a useful way of thinking about beyond what is beyond retail, rather than just kind of tweaking at the edges, to stand in a space in your high street and almost close your eyes and try and picture yourself, first of all, in the 1st horizon. Where are we? What is it that we're doing here? What have we got? What is our legacy? What are the assets? And then to try to think about that future. What would it be like to have genuinely vibrant, sustainable town centres? And then to look out for what are the various disruptive innovators, positive or negative, that might help that. It's just a different way of thinking, but it's really helped me and others, I think, locally to start a more creative conversation rather than just firefighting.
Thanks, Jess. Well, I guess most of us believe that those creative solutions are probably rooted in the local communities, don't we? I think, one of the things that's been clear in a lot of reports that we've been reading recently, the Grimsby Review and Power to Change reports, there's one of the things that keeps coming up is that there needs to be a shift in power away from central government to local communities, and more resources to local communities and more leadership in local communities. But we're not really good at that in this country, are we? What's happening this week in the last few days with the COVID response just demonstrates how over-centralised we are in England, especially. And we're quite a long way from that at the moment. So, I guess that's one of the questions here. What do we do to help capacity build local grassroots organisations? Are there any examples from elsewhere? In one of the future webinars that we've got, we're going to be inviting Dumfries Mid-Steeple Quarter to speak about an interesting development there. They're a community benefit society in Dumfries, and they've basically purchased a block, of the old high street properties. They've managed to get funding in from a mix of local and national government, private investors, and local crowdfunding. I kind of thinking that I think it's been described as the UK's first kind of big high street community ownership development. Is it because they're in Scotland? Is that why they're kind of ahead of the game? Because in England, again, that kind of over centralised state is maybe holding things back. Is that what are people's thoughts on that?
Isn't there something about ambition as well? It's about where we set our ambitions. Recently, we were talking to Nudge in Plymouth about Union Street, and we're talking, why don't you just buy the whole street? You could afford, you know, with £4 million, you could buy the whole street, and then you could really kind of govern and nurture some change, but instead of like one property at a time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
We've got a central fund, don't we, that doesn't currently exist, I think, from government. Sorry, Greg.
I'm just reflecting on Jess's point about Plymouth. I've been involved with town deal discussions in 2 coastal towns in Lincolnshire recently, in Skegness and Mablethorpe, and it was interesting to hear that in amongst the raft of ideas put forward in this huge public consultation, there was a real push from members of the public for a high street regeneration scheme, which led to us being involved in planning a kind of heritage-led regeneration scheme. But I found it really interesting that that wasn't one of the ideas that was initially put forward. It was something that came very much from the public, and then the local authority was in a position where they had to find a partner to come up with some solution for that. And I think, as Jess was saying, there are opportunities with funds like this. These are £25 million for small towns who haven't seen the likes of those big sums of money for a very long time, and even less so to spend almost completely within their gift. And I think the scale of ambition is an interesting one for somewhere like Skegness, which is very much a left behind town that doesn't really currently value its heritage. A multi-million pound investment has the potential to completely transform a historic town centre. And to do so, hopefully learning some of the lessons from the Townscape Heritage Historic England funded schemes in the past, but perhaps work a bit more flexibly and a bit more tailored to the specific local needs of those kind of areas. So I think there's an excitement there about some of those funds and what we can do with them. But I think historically, there's not been a huge amount of that in England necessarily.
No, there's certainly a lot of money coming in from government through the Future High Streets Fund and the Towns deal. I mean, there's a serious commitment, obviously, from national government for doing this. There do seem to be signs of serious community engagement going on or being attempted. We have such a poor track record, I think, historically. It's
Have you seen evidence of that, Gavin? Good community engagement in town deals, or?
It remains to be seen, doesn't it? Because obviously it's still in the assessment process. But I know that is supposedly part of the package. You know, that's a new kind of approach that they're trying to take, I think, in MHCLG this time. But as I said, historically, the private, the public, and the community sector has not worked very well in local areas to make this happen.
I think, as usual, though, we're fighting between rushing and doing things properly. I'm always interested in sustained impatience. I think we should be impatient. We should get on with things. But it seems to me that a lot of the town deals are trying to create really big plans at a speed that probably, especially in COVID times, that doesn't really help with community engagement.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a danger of rushing at some of these things, particularly in an effort to have some big flagship schemes for each of these kind of left behind towns. There's inevitably that kind of political push for big schemes that haven't necessarily been subject to the same level of public consultation. But I think the opportunity I see is to democratise that somewhat by spreading the benefits more widely and looking at larger area-based schemes where you're talking to lots of businesses, lots of owners, and dealing with a wider area. So that after you've got an in-principle agreement for town deals for this money, you can dig deeper and do further consultation while you're building up the plans, rather than pin all your hopes on one large flagship multi-million pound development.
Yeah, and within community wealth building, that kind of development is known as inward investment, which is obviously attracting outside finance and businesses to come into a particular area as that kind of flagship. And the story from Preston is that kind of 2011, John Lewis was staged to come in as the kind of flagship store around a really large development. They pulled out as the kind of the ongoing shadow of the economic crisis. And it was really then that the kind of, Preston City Council sat down, looked to the States, to Cleveland, and kind of looked at a model which started with economic development at home, rather than just attracting, lots of money from the outside. And like Jess is saying, rushing it, doing it poorly, and not engaging people, in their own communities.
I was struck, Jess, by Hastings Commons, that kind of partnership there. It's all very grassroots. It is community led. Where does the local authority fit into that, and any kind of private sector involvement? Does that quite understand?
Yeah. So the Commons is that very small, fine-grained bit of neighbourhood where we're bringing together building by building, and then that sits within the Trinity Triangle Heritage Action Zone, which has more partners in it. And the council is a full partner in the Heritage Action Zone. It's just that it's a partner, not the leader. So the Heart of Hastings is like, a lead among equals to push that forward. But because it's not just about whose name goes on the bid, is it? It's about the process by which you create the bid and then the process by which you deliver it. And that process is happening right there inside that little community. It's being led from within that neighbourhood. And it just means it's very different. I noticed Yvonne's question on the Padlet there about the kind of organic capacity building, and I do think that's really important. I think the reason we were able to do that, there are two reasons. One was that the council was distracted by a Future High Streets Fund bid, so they were busy doing a £25 million bid and they let us do a £2 million bid. And the other was that they and other partners trusted us because we've been working for so long in that neighbourhood, and it really does take a sustained period of time. But in answer to Anonymous's question about how can you do it given how long it takes, the answer is just get started. Start with something. We started with a meanwhile lease on the basement of Rock House for £200 a month. And that was because we were there, we were in a position where the agent phoned us up and said, do you want to buy the building? And then we had to scrabble around and buy the building, but we didn't have the money for the renovation. We bought the building and then we raised the money and did a bit of the building. And so on the one hand, you've got to do a little bit at a time, and on the other hand, you've got to be really ambitious about where you're heading.
Greg, is that similar to your experience in Lincolnshire, working with local authorities as well, that you've been seen as more of a trusted equal partner in places like Boston?
Yeah, I think very, very much so, because we were already doing some of the work, for example, in Boston and Lincolnshire, running their Townscape Heritage Scheme and formerly their Historic England Seeker Scheme. When these coastal towns were faced with the prospect of a £25 million town deal, overwhelming local support for a town centre initiative, and they needed some support to put a plan together for that, we were approached as Jess was saying, as a kind of trusted pair of hands, as an organisation that is based locally, knows the communities and has done similar work. So I think that has paid dividends.
So what more support do we think community-led grassroots organisations need to be able to take on more historic buildings in town centres? I mean, I think it's fair to say the Community Right to Buy, the Localism Act, is kind of, has that been enough? There hasn't been a huge amount of community asset transfers happening, for example, in recent years. It seems like the legislation hasn't gone far enough, or is there an issue about lack of capacity in communities? I was wondering what else it is. What are the barriers to greater community ownership on the high street?
I think it may touch on one of the points, one of the questions, the anonymous question submitted I see is about becoming community organisers. And to me, it speaks of a lack of skills and in some cases confidence from people about taking on buildings, that it's still, I completely agree with Jess that sometimes you have to get on and do it, but to people and organisations who haven't done it, it's a terrifying prospect. So I think a lot of it is a bit more of that early stage hand holding, looking at similar schemes, the kind of work that HTN do a lot of already, to be frank, in coaching, mentoring, seeing how other people have done it, looking at the models, the literatures, and trying to demystify it.
There is a problem with the asset of community value, and legislation from a heritage perspective, which is that empty buildings that have been empty for more than 5 years, even if they've had 100 years of community interest in the past, they often are not, the councils don't accept them as listable. And of course, many of the buildings that we want to see and have some kind of community use may never have done before. They might have been carpet shops. So in some ways, Localism Act does provide some help, but not for where we are right now. What we need right now is better funding systems, is one of the biggest things we need right now. There is funding out there, but I spend probably 60 to 70% of my time raising funds from, we've had 58 different grants and loans since 2014 to do the buildings we've been doing. And it is a ludicrous waste of people's time to, when we've got the track record, to have to do so much work to raise little bits of money, rather than having some kind of pipeline of community recovery, heritage, whatever you want to call it. It could be called anything you like. Levelling up communities, Danny Kruger has been suggesting. I don't care what it's called, but I don't want it to be quite as hard as all the stuff we've had to raise to get as far as we have.
And just to pick up on the question on community organisers that Greg saw as well, the Plunkett Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, did the State of Rural Community Business Report. Yeah, they've been working in rural communities for, I think, 100 years now, celebrated the anniversary a couple of years ago now. And yeah, they do a lot of work around community organising and community engagement in terms of how you develop community businesses. Yeah, outside of kind of large towns and cities. So I think the Plunkett Foundation are a really, really good resource for you to look up and take a look at their work. They've got a whole range of programs, more than a pub, but you can get in touch with any inquiry to kind of support the start of that process.
I was just going to add, if you're reading questions from the Padlet, could you just state the question so that we can all kind of home in on it and see which one it is, because I wasn't sure which one you were referring to then. It's not always kind of easy to see, but that's a good point. We talked a little bit about one of the issues of being in the middle of the COVID pandemic is the fact that maybe things are happening a bit too fast without that kind of long-term thinking. Are there any positive lessons from the COVID crisis we can take out of this to make the high streets more resilient? A question for Greg, maybe?
One of the lessons for me, just thinking of our own experience at the Old King's Head and our forthcoming capital project in the centre of Lincoln, is about trying to somehow find a way of embedding flexibility into the capital stage of the project to de-risk to some extent the kind of ongoing revenue model for a building. So the kind of thing I'm thinking is making use of flexibility for conversion from office to residential, for example, that if as part of planning capital development, we can plan the M&E and the partitions in such a way that any future transition from one end use to another is more straightforward than it would otherwise have been. That seems to me to be a sensible way forward. And at the Old King's Head, we, midway through the construction phase, turned the stable blocks from office to further B&B accommodation, which we think is better suited to the economy and the visitor economy as it is at the moment. But I think building that kind of flexibility into future projects should benefit everyone if we're able to do so.
One of the difficulties of easy transition is the fact that the regulations, the whole regulatory framework for residential is quite different from commercial, and that it sometimes feels like nobody's ever heard of mixed use. When you come to dealing with the actual building regs and trying to create a mixed use environment, a mixed use building, it's like, you can't do that. So we have managed to, there are always ways around it, but it would help for government or whoever is responsible for building regs to spend some time thinking about how mixed use actually works in practice and how to make it safe without making it impossible to do. That wasn't about COVID though. I'd say the COVID thing is innovation. Is that I don't think there's ever been a time, or certainly not in my lifetime, ever been a time where there's been more rapid, more widespread adaptation going on in every field of almost every single person's life. And that is an incredible thing to be happening. So, and it's scary and you know, fairly miserable for a lot of people, but it is actually a time of enormous learning and sharing, all this kind of online sharing at the same time. So it's a really great opportunity that we have to take to work better together to create better futures.
I think there's an interesting tension though of how much we change and how quickly. Just before the call, Jess was kind of remarking on this idea of building back better, and to make the point that of course we don't want to go back, we want to create something different, we want to create a new future. I think at the same time, of course, there are some things that did work, and we've got to be careful not to marginalize and push them out. And I think, yeah, we can really change use on certain buildings, but that might change for 5, 10, 15 years. And it might be really difficult when we come out of COVID, whatever that looks like, to pull back and actually use them maybe for their original use, which might have created lots of what I called in my presentation, economic and social outcomes. That the obvious tension there is with business survival. We're changing and adapting so we survive as businesses that can keep paying staff. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really, really interesting period just to see kind of how flexible we can be in those changes and how we kind of build that into strategies, and just how much we acknowledge that these are kind of temporary, intermittent changes where they need to be, and whether they might be more permanent strategic moves where we actually think this is a really good place to move into.
Your point earlier about the economy and the jobs, I read something earlier that said that social enterprises, for every £100,000 of turnover, they create 3 jobs, whereas a private enterprise creates, I think it was 0.86 jobs. And you know, we know that social enterprises and community businesses have proved more resilient, as have locally rooted private businesses, small-scale private businesses. You know, not all of them, of course, and a lot of them have suffered, but some have really come into their own. So we should remember that those are the answers. The answers are never going to be about propping up the chains to bring them back. The answers are about new, vibrant uses that are locally grown.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's old data now, but I did a report, kind of an economic blueprint for West Dorset, where I'm based, and yeah, the figure was, you know, local family, locally owned businesses create a job for every £30,000 of turnover, compared with the local supermarkets, 1 job for every £160,000 of turnover. So yeah, and we know this is all political in terms of where funding will go, but yeah, we also know that we have something that we can support through the way that we spend and we consume, and the way, you know, that we support local business during this period, definitely. And heritage initiatives, you know, Greg talked earlier about kind of residential, and I think, you know, heritage assets becoming sites of employment and kind of increasing that role over the next year or 2, I think is really, really important alongside that as well. You know, it's not limited to young people, but as I said in my, you know, my presentation, you know, we're talking about a huge disproportionate impact on school, university leavers, and those people that haven't got established careers. And yeah, how we do, you know, socially distanced kind of employment incubator hubs are going to be a really interesting kind of use for heritage assets over the next year or so, rather than them just being generally closed to the public.
I wonder if we can connect to the Kickstart programme, the £2 billion programme to support placements for young people. Locally, we've put in combination with community businesses around the country, we've put in an application for just 12 in Hastings, but 86 altogether across the group. And you know, those people, I'm really excited. I hope we do get them, but because every town needs to do something for those young people, and if we can do it through Kickstart, and not only will it help them right now, but hopefully they'll become interested in different aspects of that neighbourhood and of heritage and of buildings and community and so on. So it'll give them something for a much longer term than just this crisis.
Bev, I'm just wanting to bring you in here because I'm not sure if we need to now move to kind of responding to things on the Padlet in the time that we've got left. I know we've answered some of the questions. Is this the time to do that?
Yeah, it probably is. I've got quite a few questions on there. I mean, I think some of them you've probably touched on with what you're saying, what you've been saying already. So shall I go through them? I don't know how well you can see them where you are. I know the screen always ends up a little bit smaller. If I start from the top, we've got Yvonne who said many local authorities unwilling to transfer freehold. Does this track projects into a grant model rather than an enterprise or borrowing model? Anybody wants to have a go at that?
We're taking on one of the buildings that we're taking on for Heart of Hastings is an asset transfer from the county council, and it is a leasehold. It's a 99-year lease, so it's pretty good. But even that does have implications. Everything else that we've got is freehold, and so we're kind of used to what you can do with freehold, and leases are slightly different. I think it's just important to get good legal advice, I would say, on that, on what can you do in terms of borrowing against a lease. It depends what the lease is worth. It's still an asset.
Yeah, and I mean, it, you know, commercial companies have leases and they still run good businesses which trade and generate income. So, of course, yeah, getting a really good long lease is obviously the kind of ideal position. But I think in terms of enterprise and borrowing, yeah, if you can get a good lease, there should be no reason that you can't get loans or raise community shares and, you know, run an enterprise which generates income.
David from HTN has asked, what new uses do you think can best replace the footfall and vibrancy that retail generated previously? $1 million question, that.
Community sauna.
I think there are many answers, aren't there? Yes.
We probably need a whole different workshop on that one. If I go to, there's an anonymous one. Is it possible that the community right to buy does not give the timescale that it's needed to attract funding?
Yeah. 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 I mean, more generally, outside of the community right to buy, just the timescales that it often takes to create a community of interest. You know, think about legal structures, starting to fundraise. I mean, the disadvantage that community groups face compared with, you know, commercial competitors for any space, you know, who have capital, you know, that can be transferred within days is just, you know, it's extremely long process. And Jess might know if this exists, but one of the kind of approaches that I've always thought, which would be interesting on a kind of local regional basis, would be almost like a community hedge fund, where you have a kind of hedge fund of 200, 300, 400 investors. You have their investment interests, their priorities, be it food and farming, be it retail, be it heritage, be it community energy, and you kind of have a system that's ready to move a lot quicker to respond to opportunities, you know, in those kind of circumstances. Because even talking again to jump to councils or to other partners, or even to convince your local community, if they've got low exposure to community ownership, for instance, is that, you know, you're starting even further back. So if you're in a community that's got almost no examples or no culture, then that community interest, that community of interest is going to take a while to develop before you even get to the point talking about what legal structures you might use, what kind of funding sources you might use, and how you can kind of, you know, deliver something. So yeah,
I think that's right. And there's another delay, which is when you have to wait until a property that you want to purchase comes up, and then you have to go around and talk to all the funders about it. What we really need is what we've called in the past, it's not a particularly nice name, but a war chest. I quite like community hedge fund as well, but something that's there available for when the appropriate project comes up. And I am actually doing at the moment a piece of research for the Heritage Action Zone about a kind of neighbourhood investment mechanism. We're not even calling it a fund. We're not calling it anything yet. Some kind of mechanism to raise funds, which would then be available beyond the lifetime of the HAS to invest in these kind of things, which we don't yet know what they are. But let's build that war chest in advance of knowing what they are, because otherwise it will be too late. So yeah, I'm doing that research at the moment. So if anyone's got any knowledge, examples, suggestions about that, I'd be very interested.
It would be great to learn how that develops over time, Jess. From the point of view of HTN, it'd be great to hear more about that.
And just a quick question from me, just in terms of from the kind of heritage perspective, how often do you think, kind of roughly, it's a group of people responding to a particular asset which has, come on the market or has been kind of assigned at risk, compared with existing organisations that have got a portfolio of heritage buildings that's kind of relatively mature organisation? Just thinking of that kind of delay and disadvantage, because the mature kind of operations that you have in Hastings gives you a bit more agility, more confidence with funders, and the ability to draw down political, financial support in ways that, a group that's kind of responding to an initiative as it kind of comes on stream.
That's why we have to help each other, which is why HTN is so good, and all the networks are so important, because when you're starting up, you said it earlier, it's terrifying, and I totally get that. It carries on being fairly terrifying, I have to admit.
If we move on to the next question, we've got a question from an attendee that Sarah's pulled across into Padlet, saying, I didn't think you could get tax relief on property-based share issues.
I don't know if Jess or Gavin can correct me, but my understanding is that, the kind of the social investment tax relief, 30% is kind of applicable so long as you get the community share mark. But Jess,
it depends what you're going to do. So it depends entirely what you're going to do with the property. If you're going to raise the shares to buy the property to deliver your service in, that's eligible. But if you're going to buy the property and rent it out, or rent out rooms in it, and the majority of your income will come from rent, that isn't. So that isn't eligible for social investment tax relief. So you have to be really careful which way you're going.
That's great. I'm going to move across to the other side of the Padlet. A question for Greg. Please give a bit more info on the legal structure or ownership model for the Old King's Head. You mentioned that you've got an arm's length body.
Yes, that's right. So the building we now own the freehold of, as I mentioned, thanks to loan finance from AHF, and that's owned by the charity. We're a charitable trust. And the new arm's length body that we've incorporated is a standard limited company limited by guarantee, wholly owned by the charity, with a number of nominated officers and trustees of the company acting as directors. And the new entity will be operating the building but not owning the building. So it's a fairly standard operating structure for arm's length bodies, isolates the risk in terms of the ongoing operation, but allows us to retain some control and ultimately ownership of the operation.
That's great, thanks Greg. There was a question that I posted on when we started the Padlet off, because I knew that from past experience you've worked with a lot of partners on the Old King's Head in the local area, and I just wanted to ask the panel, how important has partnership working contributed to the success of your projects? Are partnerships going to be even more important in the future, not just for, say, community engagement, but for being more attractive to funders, say?
Yeah, I think it's all important, and I think it will continue to be all important. I think you can't, as Jess mentioned earlier, you can't do these things for people. You have to do them with people if you want them to be successful. So that's got to be at the heart of projects, and I don't see that going anywhere.
Yeah. How about, how can we get grant funding with its notoriously long lead-in times to work alongside a just get on with it approach?
This, I'm not pretending this is easy, because it isn't. I've mentioned that we had 58 different sources, but I think that's kind of what you have. Well, that was the experience we had. That was what we had to do. Was break up your. This is the point about phased development. Phased organic development is that in some ways the reason it's organic is because you can't plan properly because you don't really know. But also it's organic because if you do one bit and you get people into it and they start using it as tenants, as users, they become part of your team. They build the capacity. So to do something that you can manage with the funding that you can get hold of, and that builds your capacity as a community, and then do the next thing. And so each element is not entirely self-contained at all, but from the funder's point of view, sometimes it is. And I do think that's the way to do it in the current environment where there's such fragmented funding environment. I would much rather see a locally based institution of some description that was able to manage a number of different sources of funding, which would include community shares, raising community shares, as well as getting grant funding. And to be honest, the lead-in times are not, some of them are still really long, some of them have got even longer, but there are a lot of shorter scale ones now, including, I would urge everybody to try and find out more about their local enterprise partnership if you don't already have any relationship with them. Because although I avoided DAOs for many years because it struck me as an insult to the word local, that it was Essex, Kent and East Sussex, but it's proved really fantastically useful in the last few months in terms of getting funding and support for our projects. So it's worth looking.
That's a really good tip, Jess. There's a question here that I posted because I was asked this at a webinar that we were hosting this morning, and it's mainly for Gavin, I suppose. But does the Architectural Heritage Fund fund improvements to a high street building's accessibility, a historic high street building?
Yeah, the short answer is no, I'm afraid. We do have a small pot within the Transforming Places Through Heritage programme for capital works to buildings, but really that's just focused on a very small number of particularly innovative proposals, and it's really about the whole kind of redundant building being brought back into a new use. So there may be accessibility improvements as part of that bigger project, but not just on its own. Basically, I'm afraid we don't have those kind of funds available. But if it met the wider criteria of the programme, it could be part of a wider package, as I said. Just talking about lead-in times as well, with the previous question, we like to think we're quite responsive as a funder. Obviously, it's small grants, but we do try to make decisions within a matter of weeks rather than months generally. So hopefully that helps in the early stages of projects.
That's great. Thanks, Gavin. How can councils encourage community businesses?
I was going to try and answer that with the other one: policymakers, local authorities, funders. What are the arguments we can make for historic buildings? And I think for me, I think it's focusing on those economic and social outcomes and who's involved. And those economic and social outcomes might be affordable housing, the residential offer. It might be more employment space and work hubs for a particular, group that are furthest from the economy, such as young adults. But I think focusing on those uses, those economic and social outcomes, and who's involved in co-producing those is so important. Because it's not that the heritage aspect is is not important, but it's just a case of making those things work together, and keeping historic buildings open and renovated by ensuring that they are, as I said earlier, kind of economically relevant, because being economically relevant, and again, as broadly as possible, is what is going to secure that asset on a long-term basis, compared with what a small group of people might think is the best current way to use that building and the best current focus. But I think that's the best place, is start with those outcomes and then kind of build it from there.
I think it also touches on the previous question from Yvonne about transferring from local authorities of assets either on a freehold or leasehold basis. I think one way that councils can encourage community businesses is by being a little more proactive and having more of an open discussion with the voluntary and community sector about disposal of key assets and the terms on which those would be best disposed of to benefit community businesses on a case-by-case basis.
That's great, thank you.
And then on a more long-term basis, I mean, we're working with Co-ops UK at the moment with the Cooperative Council Innovation Network, which is a group of 32 councils that kind of self-described as cooperative councils, and we basically just kind of got first initial interest in a leadership program, because what we're finding is that councils are kind of signing up to different national frameworks and campaigns, but not actually doing any internal training to support their officers and their staff members to actually sensitively and appropriately deliver it. So, I mean, obviously that's probably not the kind of answer that you might be looking for, but obviously it's supporting councils as much as encouraging them to understand these frameworks and understand how they can be sufficiently involved to support it. I don't know of any councils yet that have invested in community share issues, but maybe that's something that could happen. And back to training and education. Councils are meant to be, skills development and training public sector bodies, and I think, of course, that needs to expand into social enterprise, community business, and co-ops to really support to develop, those kind of new cultures in different places.
Thanks, Johnny. Last couple of questions. Yvonne says, I am interested in the question of why so many of the HAS projects are local authority led. Isn't part of the problem the lack of previous organic capacity building in local communities? I was very impressed by Jess's partnership model.
I think the reason that so many are local authority led is that that's the norm. That's what they were in the past. So both Townscape Heritage Initiatives and the first round of Heritage Action Zones were primarily council led. So in a sense, we should congratulate Historic England on making sure that their guidance for the High Street Heritage Action Zones allowed for community-led bids. A lot of the templates and the contracts and so on are still very, very council focused. And I think in some ways we're quite challenging to Historic England just by existing, just by not being a council. And I think they welcome that. They've said to us right from the beginning, we want to learn from this. So I hope that they will learn from it, from ours and from the Tildesley HAS, which is also emerged from the community, quite a different one. I think from our point of view, well, you have to be able to present some kind of coherent voice. And too often communities are full of groups that don't talk to each other, that don't like each other, that fall out in public or in front of other partners. And you just have to kind of not do that. Don't wash your dirty linen in public, have conversations offline, build that trust and value base to the partnership. And only when you feel confident that that partnership is strong, that's when you go for the kind of bid like a Heritage Action Zone, because it's a serious thing to do, to run a 4-year programme across a whole neighbourhood that includes all kinds of businesses and residents. It's got to be done properly, and I think that you have to get your partnership in place, and that partnership shouldn't, I love the phrase that partnership is the suppression of mutual loathing in pursuit of cash. That's what they used to be, and that's what too many of them still are. But I'm absolutely clear that that's not what ours is. Ours is in pursuit of change, positive change that we've all signed up to, and that's what makes the difference and makes it hopefully an effective approach.
Could I quickly ask Jess, you mentioned retirement and the community business sector has been looking at succession as a potential kind of opportunity. And again, in talking in terms of lead time, it's something that we need to be doing now in terms of, talking to family business owners in particular localities, especially those in heritage buildings. How much does that feature in your work in Hastings, and in terms of that heritage action zone, in terms of thinking we can secure these so long as we put in that work now to work alongside these business owners that will be soon retiring?
We do a little bit of that, but to be honest, change is so fast at the moment that there's so much turnover. I mean, Hastings is definitely not doing as badly as some towns, because thankfully we never really had the chains that a lot of towns had that have now closed. So we are doing better than some places, and our independent shops are doing well, but they are facing massive rent rises. They're facing this kind of whole, what do they call it, perfect storm of pandemic and gentrification, and people are moving. I almost don't like to say it because I don't want to encourage everybody to move to Hastings, because there are already a lot of people moving in, and that's putting the rents up both for residential and for commercial, and that is going to be our biggest problem in the future. There's going to be a huge turnover, and I worry. That's why what we do is the capped rents, because we want to make sure there's always affordable places to live and to work and to set up businesses in the town to keep it vibrant. So it's less retiring. I mean, I did mention retiring in terms of Dalton's carpets, and the good thing about that is we've been in conversation with that particular individual for now since February, and he's waiting for us, thankfully, to get ourselves organised and to pull together the money to be able to let him retire to Crewe, which is his life plan. No, nothing funny about that. I miss Crewe. I haven't been to the northwest for too long. I want to get back there.
Thanks, Jess. Right, very last question. I think you've all done an amazing job of squeezing so much information into this short amount of time. From David, are there ways in which e-commerce or online shopping can be used to complement and support high street retail instead of destroying it?
There's one example that I know of from a few years ago. I was running a grant and loan scheme in Derby for the City Council, an economic regeneration scheme, and we had a furniture retailer who was considering opening a store in the town centre or an out-of-town retail park. And part of the grant and loan funding deal was that they would invest in the town centre, which was the preference to benefit the high street, but also as part of that there'd be grant funding support for them to turn some of the back office and basement space into a logistics hub to serve their e-commerce. And that as a model in that particular case seemed to work very well, that you had the kind of the showroom, the shared staffing throughout the building, and the ability to have a logistics space within a high street, which is not an easy fit. It's not as cost effective for the business as being an out of town unit with easy access to highways. So it did require that level of public sector subsidy in effect to offset the increased cost of doing it on a high street, but it did prove to be an effective model.
Just to build on that, I think you used the phrase showroom, and I've heard people talk a lot now about showrooming, that actually the shops are less a large retail experience and more a space that you might go and look at, but also they're beautifully designed so that they can be photographed, so that they'll look good on a website or on Instagram. So it becomes part of the brand. The shop is part of the brand that the e-shop is actually doing most of the retail. But the shop itself is still very important as that kind of physical brand of the shop, which is interesting. I don't know whether that's a good or a good thing, but presumably it will mean that shops get looked after. If people do that, they will look after the fabric and make sure it looks nice, which is kind of good.
That's true. Right, that's all of the questions done, I think.
Can I just add one more thing on that? If that is part of the future, if that's part of the future, then business rates is totally unfit for purpose. I think perhaps we already knew that, but certainly it's not. You wouldn't be able to do that if you were paying high street business rates for your shop. So that is a clear area where we have to think differently.
Definitely, yeah. So over to you, Gavin.
Well, I just wind up there and say thank you again to everybody. I mean, I don't think we've totally solved the high street crisis this afternoon, but some really interesting ideas and insights from your experience on the ground there from all our panelists. I think thank you from me. And I think Bev, you just wanted to highlight future events and the feedback form. Is that right? Before we leave.
Yeah. yeah, just a very quick one. Just I would love it if everybody could fill in the feedback form that you'll receive in about an hour, for obvious reasons. And if you could check out our events page on the website, we've got more Open High Streets webinars coming up and lots of other events too, including our conference that I really have to plug. But that was it from me.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So thanks for everybody for coming. I'll end the webinar now. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.